Hi good people, my name is Doran Shafrir and I am a philosopher, which makes me unqualified to do absolutely anything except sitting here and recording this video. Today we're going to take a look at Trigonometry's latest video, or maybe it's no longer its latest video, but it's a video that came out lately, in which Konstantin Kisin says that he's off the fence about the war in Gaza. What I'm going to do here is, as a fancy philosopher, I am going to critique his arguments. Now, keep in mind, I am not going to critique his opinion, only his arguments. If they're valid, maybe tell you a little bit of fun stuff about these arguments. And that's it, let's get going.
I'm off the fence about Israel's war. Here's why. I read, watched, and listened to the endless commentary, debates, and discussions to understand what people on various sides were saying. I then did my best to apply first principles thinking to the arguments I heard.
What is first principles thinking? So here's the idea. A first principle is something that you do not have to prove, something that is an axiom. I'll give you an example. Let's say I were to ask, a kid were to ask me, why does the sun come up in the morning? And my answer will be, well, because the earth is rotating. And he would ask me, why does the earth rotate? And then my answer would be, well, because of some fancy physics stuff, laws of physics, whatever, and gravity. I don't know. I'm not a physicist. I'm a philosopher, which is nothing. At some point during the line of questioning, I will no longer be able to answer the question. It will be a statement that stands by itself. For example, he will ask, why do the laws of physics exist? I will have to say, well, they just do. Okay, so that's a first principle. Another way to look at first principles is to look at the rules of logic. For example, if I try to make a logical argument, basically all logic depends on the fact that something cannot both be and not be at the same time, right? Basically all of logic depends on that. That it cannot be that something is true and also not true at the same time. Now, if a kid were to ask me why is this the law of logic, then my response would have to be, it just is. It's a first principle. So essentially what Konstantin Kisin does here is he uses the term first principles when essentially what he probably means is logic. So saying first principles thinking is just another way of saying logical thinking with more words. But I must say I do like the term.
When it comes to highly emotive situations like this one, people often flood you with emotional context, which does not support the argument they're actually making.
Right, this is just another way of saying that he's going to try to think logically about this. When he speaks about supporting or not supporting argument, well, I guess we need to talk about how arguments work. So in the field of logic, an argument can be either valid or invalid, or some would call it sound or unsound. What makes an argument sound? Okay, so are you sitting? An argument is sound if and only if there could be no possible world in which all of its premises are true and its conclusion is false. To give you an example of a valid argument, premise 1, all dogs bark. Premise 2, Rexy is a dog. Conclusion, Rexy barks. There is no possible world in which these assumptions, these premises are true and the conclusion is false. It is impossible, which makes this argument sound. Now, keep in mind, it doesn't have to be true that all dogs bark, right? A valid argument, a sound argument, is not essentially necessarily a true argument. What is true, though, is that if the premises are true and the argument is sound, then also the conclusion must be true.
First principles thinking helps you see the structure of arguments. The logic of an argument is like the skeleton of a body. You cannot see it from the outside, but it is usually the cause of why the body moves the way that it does.
Right, this is just a fancy way of saying that he's gonna think logically. I don't see the point in this. But I guess it's a cool narrative.
First, the easiest way to understand a complicated problem is to find a comparable situation about which you already know what to think.
Okay, so what he's doing here, it's not necessarily a logical way of thinking, but it does fit the common law justice system. The common law justice system basically revolves around finding cases that were similar in the past and then seeing, well, what did we say about that case? And maybe we should say the same about this case. So I don't know if I would call this first principles, because justice and law notoriously have not that much to do with logic. So, but still, I think it's still a good way to go on about it. It's just a funny choice of words.
On a proportionate basis, the Western world has never experienced an attack on this scale. If we take 9/11, the most impactful terrorist attack in living memory, which shook the world's dominant superpower to its very core, we see that 2,977 people were killed. On October 7th, approximately 1,200 people were killed in a country of just 9 million people. October 7th was at least 12 times as bad as 9/11. And that's before accounting for the fact that Hamas took hundreds of hostages, many of whom have been killed since. If thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted?
Okay, so we kind of jumped between things here. The first point was that we cannot really compare what happened on October the 7th in Israel to anything, any terror attack in the history of the Western world. And that is because the ratio of casualties per capita, basically, is incomparable to anything else. And this, I guess you could call this first principles thinking, because it's based on math, right? He's just doing math on a per capita basis. And math is, one could say that it is based on first principles, because if you were to ask me, well, why do you believe math? Why do you believe that 1 + 1 = 2? I would have to say, well, these are just the rules of math. I can't, it's not something that I choose to believe. It's a first principle. I don't have to justify it. So that is first principles thinking. So when he says that it's impossible to compare the 7th of October to anything else based on this argument, it's kind of a valid point. But then he moves on to something else. Then he moves on to what would happen if the same ratio of event were to happen to the United States. Let's say from Mexico, the United States would obliterate Mexico. So what he's trying to do, he's not going to previous cases as he would in the justice system of the Commonwealth. What he does instead is he says there are no previous scenarios that fit the occasion, because this is unprecedented. So what we have to do is we have to imagine what would have happened if a similar thing were to occur on United States soil. And this move kind of works. So this gets a thumbs up for me, at least philosophically speaking.
There are some persuasive arguments from the anti-Israel camp which are aimed at contextualizing October 7th. Let's look at them. Number one, history did not start on October 7th. The crux of this argument, when broken down to its central premise, is that the state of Israel is illegitimate. Israel is a settler colonial state.
I have to add to that argument, to strengthen the pro-Palestinian side, what they would say in addition, when they say that history did not start on October 7th, they would not just cite the state of Israel as being illegitimate, but they would also cite numerous occasions in which Israel behaved wrongly. Maybe even in the past several years. They don't have to go back all the way to its founding.
2. October 7th was a response to Israeli brutality and oppression.
Whoops. Okay, so that's what I just said. But essentially, this is a continuation of the previous argument, right? That history did not start on October 7th. So it's kind of 2 and 1 are kind of the same arguments here. I don't know, it's the same argument.
3. Israel is killing civilians. The scenes of parents pulling their children out of rubble speak for themselves. 4. Israel is engaged in indiscriminate attacks, which is why so many innocent people are dying.
Okay, so I guess now he's going to try to address all of these arguments. Let's see how he does it, and let's see if he follows his first principles thinking.
Let's go through the arguments one by one. And for the sake of argument, let us accept that every point in each argument is valid and historically accurate.
Okay, so this is actually a good move. In order to really attack the logical structure of the argument, which is what he attempts to do, he calls this first principles thinking, but essentially what he does is to attack the logic of an argument, to attempt to do so at least. We'll see if he's successful. What's important is to assume that it is true. Because if someone were to say to me, for example, let's go with point number one, history did not start on October 7th, or maybe Israel has been very oppressive towards the Palestinians, there are two options for me to answer him, if I want to answer him, assuming I disagree. The first option would be to dispute his claim, which is saying, I will show him instances in which Israel was not brutal, and I will dispute his historical claims and his historical narrative. So I will just say, look, you're wrong. This is option number one. Option number two, which is more aligned with logic and first principles thinking, as Konstantin Kisin calls it, the other option is to say, look, I'm not going, let's assume you're correct. Even if we assume that you're correct, I have this point and this point and this point and this point, which makes your entire argument invalid. So this is what Konstantin is trying to do here.
The first argument, whose central premise is that Israel is illegitimate, seems to be at the core of every debate. If Israel was created through illegitimate means, it puts the discussion on an entirely different footing, doesn't it? Well, actually, no, it doesn't. Again, let's think from first principles. We must look for a comparable situation in which a country was created through some form of displacement of the native population. Most of you live in such a country. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are all the products of invasion, colonization, and brutal conquest. If you go back far enough, so is almost every other country in the world. The United States government would not tolerate missile strikes and terrorist rampages from Native American reservations.
Okay, so the argument here is based more, I guess, on judicial grounds than on philosophical grounds, but that also kind of works because judiciary is, I guess, a kind of philosophy. What he's doing here is comparing it to similar cases, as he said he would do, and he shows that Israel is, even if we accept the premise that it's founded on illegitimate means, that does not mean that you get to destroy it now. Now, the pro-Palestinian crowd who would side with the argument that he's trying to dispute would actually have a pretty good response to this. What he's saying is valid, but what they would answer, in order to remain logically consistent, is that the US, Canada, Australia, and all of these countries should also be decolonized, right? That if the natives were numerous enough, as they are in Israel or Palestine, they should act as Hamas acts or as the Palestinians act. They should resist the occupation. And this is actually an argument that I've also heard in some debates that I've been in. So it's an argument, well, it works, but it's not a slam dunk.
The second argument centers on the idea that October 7th was a response to Israeli occupation and brutality. This, again, seems reasonable to many people. After all, what would it take for you to behave the way Hamas did on October 7th? It was not an attack on the Israeli Defense Force. It was not a prison breakout, as some people like to describe it. Because when people break out of a prison, they don't normally head to the nearest town and start massacring women and children. October 7th was, by design and implementation, a terrorist attack whose purpose was to slaughter civilians, terrify Israeli society, and nothing else. This was not an act of resistance. It was an act of terrorism.
Okay, so what he does here is quite philosophical because he's imagining alternative worlds. For example, he's saying, let's imagine an alternative world in which the Palestinians want to do this and that. Okay, let's imagine an alternative world in which October 7th was a prison break. Does it match what actually happened in reality? And he says no. So that's quite a good move. It's not, I wouldn't say that it's structured like a logical argument, but it is a good point. Although a pro-Palestinian could definitely answer this claim. He would say something like, or she would say something like, October 7th was mainly an assault on military facilities. And when Konstantin Kisin says that October 7th was not meant to weaken Israel militarily, that could also be disputed. Because on the day of October 7th, when Hamas invaded southern Israel, Mohammed Deif, who is the head of Hamas's military wing, called on all neighboring Islamist organizations and even Muslims living inside Israel proper to rise up and get rid of the Zionist entity, as they call Israel, once and for all. So You could say that it actually was a military assault on Israel aimed at destroying it, and that destroying Israel is, in a sense, a prison break. So I don't like the argument that I've just given myself. I'm not sure it works, but one could say it.
The third argument is that Israel is killing civilians. This is the one claim made by the anti-Israel side that is undeniably true. However, this is an example of the emotive but irrelevant context I mentioned earlier. Civilians are always killed in war. Unless Israel destroys or degrades their ability to carry out their threats, it is likely to experience more terrorist attacks again and again. And who can end the killing? Well, theoretically Israel could, of course, but for the reason we just discussed, they can't, won't, and shouldn't. So yes, the deaths of civilians are tragic, but the responsibility for their deaths is entirely with Hamas, and the failure to put a stop to the killing is theirs and theirs alone.
So essentially, this argument is just, well, tough, that's war, that's how war works, deal with it. Well, he doesn't put it as crudely as I did, but that's essentially the argument. That, well, there are two arguments here. First is tough, that's war, and the second argument is Hamas is responsible for the well-being of the civilians of Gaza and not Israel. And also that Hamas is responsible for putting them in harm's way. Is that first principles thinking? I don't know if that's first principles thinking. Essentially what it is, it's accepting one side of the narrative over the other. It could be that you've accepted that side because you thought that they were being more coherent and more in line with reality, but still, this argument is a narrative argument. There's a pro-Palestinian narrative that can negate that. For example, a pro-Palestinian might say maybe something about how Israel has deliberately kept Hamas in power, blah, 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 stuff like that. So the responsibility, the ultimate responsibility is actually on Israel or something like that.
Which brings us to the final argument. Israel's attacks are indiscriminate and designed to inflict civilian casualties. It is an empirical matter. We can compare the ratio of combatant to civilian deaths in this war to others. Historically, urban warfare operations result in a casualty ratio of 9 civilians for every 1 enemy fighter killed. In Gaza, it is 2 to 1. In other words, despite the deliberate attempts by Hamas to increase the number of civilian casualties, Israel has been extraordinarily successful in reducing them. Just look at the way various commentators reacted to what has been dubbed Operation Grim Reaper. This was definitionally the most precise, targeted and surgical large-scale anti-terrorist operation in human history.
Okay, so basically his argument here is that it's false. This kind of steps out of line with the method he picked for himself, because he said at the onset that he was going to act as if the arguments are true, the pro-Palestinian arguments are true, so that he can refute them in first principles thinking, as he called it. But here he kind of disregards his own rule, and he just dismisses this claim. He just says that empirically this is not true. Now, it might be true that empirically this is not true. I guess you could look at it from other way. I mean, I can't imagine that a really pro-Palestine person can't answer this in some way or manner. But yeah, this is pretty much what he does, and it does work, right? The move that he does directly addresses the argument. It's just that he breaks his own rule.
In summary, I've engaged with an open mind and in good faith with all the anti-Israel arguments presented to me over the last year. On balance, I regard them as disingenuous, irrelevant, and designed to pull at my heartstrings in order to obscure the harsh reality of this conflict.
Whoa.
We would respond exactly the way that Israel has. The only difference is we would do so with the support of every member of the international community.
Right. Konstantin Kisin, you're a great guy. I love your work. I think you've came to... Well, I said that I'm not going to rank my opinion of your opinion, but your philosophical reasoning. And in philosophical reasoning, in this video essay, I will rank you. Who am I to rank you? I will rank you anyway. I am going to rank you, I don't know, a 7 out of 10, an 8 out of 10. What is the scale even? An 80 out of 100? 100 out of 100. I am going to rank you something that's like pretty decent. You've done a good job, logical thinking, nice thing, and stuff. Thank you, good people, for watching.